400 billion of value and a market size of 4.7 terawatt hours of battery capacity. So there will be a lot of players involved, and it's very evident if we want to design this value chain that battery supply, sustainable battery supply, but also end-of-life strategies play a key role. And I think it is in the absolute interest of everyone to really tackle this and make this transparent. And if you think about if that is done well, what we could save actually alone in the electric mobility, more than 70 gigatons of CO2 until 2050. And we could also, if we do the recycling well, most probably save up to 90% of the CO2 that is involved in the virgin material. So that is why we actually took that up, why I think it's also, you said it was incubated in 2017 to have this idea, and it was a small group that started, and now we ended up with 130 members in the Global Battery Alliance, and they actually comprise not only foundations and government agencies, but also companies from automotive, from mining, from chemicals, and from cell manufacturers, and even energy companies. So, and I think this is very clear that we have to tackle this, and this is why I'm very happy that we came along to design and have agreed on 10 guiding principles that bring transparency and also show actually how we can tackle the different important topics. And this is also why my company, as a player in this field, is strongly interested in running a sustainable value chain. And I think at the very end, it goes down to the end consumer who wants to have transparency.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. Let's drill down into the details. Benedikt, can you talk a bit more about how this actually works? You've been involved in the development. What are the actual details of this? How is it going to look from the OEM side? How are consumers and people who are curious about what's actually in what they're buying going to use this?
The battery passport is a perfect example of the magic that can happen at the World Economic Forum, because what started around a little coffee table, just looking upon Lake Geneva in 2017, turned out to be bringing us to the world's largest organization in the energy storage space. So it tells you, and I encourage everyone at the forum, is to think about the coffee table as the incubator for potentially great ideas that can have a big impact. And I like the battery passport, which is the flagship initiative of the Global Battery Alliance, among a few other projects that we work on, is because it is very tangible. It delivers impact. It's not just a conversation. It's actually something that consumers will be able to use to differentiate what went into the battery, into the electric vehicle that they will be purchasing. So it gives consumers choice. They can choose a battery that has a lower or a higher CO2 footprint. They can choose a battery that contains minerals that have been mined sustainably or not. And it's that kind of pressure that is going to really have an impact, because once you give people a choice, they will make choices and they will push. In addition to what we do as the industry, we push for certain standards. They will pull for those standards to be adopted very quickly. So the battery passport is essentially a digital twin of the physical battery that's in the car. Right? Sounds pretty simple. It's not, because you've got dozens of minerals in that product with very, very diverse sources of origin. So what we've tried to do is really to work towards something that gives a very tangible overview of the current batteries. We've got 3 pilots, one from Tesla, 2 from Audi. Funny enough, when you go around down in Davos here, some of the cars already have that sticker on it, so people can actually go now and scan the sticker. And I have a little sticker here to show you how it looks like. My ambition is that 10 years from now, every single electric vehicle has a sticker like that on the back. Right? And you can go and scan it. Let me see where that cobalt comes from. Where was it refined again? Interesting, right? Because it triggers the right discussions. And particularly if you do not have information on the provenance and the ESG compliance of those products, that raises the right questions and it puts pressure on the supply chain to be more sustainable. So in the battery passport, as you click on it, you can open it and open the website. It's publicly available. It gives you the technical specification, capacity, manufacturing history, material provenance, where the materials flow, how do they move, do they go through China, do they not go to China, go through different refiners, who is actually the manufacturer of the cell, of the precursor, and so on. And it compares that against what we've included is a greenhouse gas emissions rule book, which has been put together by a broad coalition of multi-stakeholders, which is very important. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative. This is not an industry initiative, which is very important for the acceptance of the standards that we have in this system. The battery passport will bring very new levels of transparency in the supply chain from beginning to end. You mentioned circularity, recyclability. That's going to be an important element of that, because we will have to recycle 10, 11, 12 million tons of battery materials in the very near future. So the ultimate goal is really provide end user transparency. It's a quality seal, and again, these are the kind of things that can happen around a coffee table in Davos.
Amazing. And to the point about how it actually works, I mean, it sounds like we can actually all go see how it works when we walk out of the Congress Center right now. Just briefly, Benedikt, you mentioned these partnerships and developing the proof of concept with Tesla and Audi. What did that work actually look like? Can you just take us through some of that development process? Perhaps some of the challenges for the Global Battery Alliance, and also, I suspect, real challenges for the manufacturers as well, as they had to navigate some of these new data requirements, maybe dig down into their supply chains in ways that they hadn't before.
The most important challenge is that the energy storage supply chain is highly complex and it's highly globalized. I mean, a unit of a battery material may be produced in Africa, then would be shipped for refining to China, from refining to Korea, from Korea to Japan, from Japan to the US. So you would have a unit of that battery will be going around the world 2 or 3 times before it actually ends up in the vehicle. So it's very complicated, and you have a multitude of different products that go in. And of course, you have to be very clear on what kind of standards do you want to measure. Right? You cannot measure everything in the beginning. That's why we have piloted, that's why we focused on the most immediate ones, which is CSR, particularly human rights, which is a concern in some of the supply chains, and greenhouse gas emissions, because some products in a battery or some batteries have a significantly lower CO2 footprint than others. So the complexity and the globality of that has been one of the big challenges. And then, of course, agreeing on the rules. Because we don't want to water down the rules that are being applied to the supply chain. Quite the opposite. We want to raise the standards and to make sure that we raise the bar for the industry as a whole as we build out this supply chain to be a sustainable supply chain. It's the biggest build-up of a supply chain probably since the hydrocarbon revolution at the end of the 19th century. We're witnessing a transformation in an industry that's historic, and we have to make sure that's done in a sustainable fashion.
That's great. And you just mentioned things like greenhouse gases, child labor. Martin, as you and the Alliance thought about how to measure some of these very difficult metrics, how to standardize them across the globe, as we heard, standards, operations differ vastly from region to region. How did you think about creating something that could actually translate, as it were, with a passport and come up with a common set of metrics, standards that would actually be useful for consumers and OEMs going forward?
Yeah, and I think this was the key, and that was the first obstacles we had to take as a group and actually get together, because we have quite some different perspectives. But that was also what the working groups did. They took all this different experience to actually define a rule set and, let's say, a manual how you do that. Because if you compare apples with pears, that doesn't help also the consumer and doesn't give the transparency. So what actually was done, and I think Benedikt just said this, there are many, many more which we have to do. So it is water usage, it is forced labor, it's biodiversity, which in the long run you have to do. But we said, what are the 2 crucial ones from our perspective? And this is really, on one hand, greenhouse gases, and the other part is the child labor issue. So we have actually, in working teams, been sitting together and have made, I think, the first real setup that is usable in both categories. That's more than 100 indicators actually on the child labor part, where you can assess how much you go back down to the root cause of that, and actually how you can assess your own performance in that respect. If you go to the greenhouse gas, also here we have, I think, developed a very comprehensive framework to calculate. It is a set of about 80 rules, a methodology how you actually tackle this and how you make this in a very comparable way, a kind of a manual. And I think it is a methodology that was broadly accepted by the players in the value chain, which is important. And as you mentioned, it looks like that this is now making its road in the European part, but I think the signs are also good that in the Canadian and in the American environment they will be adopted, and at the very end it has to be a global set. And I think this is where we are proud, because I think the first one that comes sets a little bit the standard. That might move a bit, then some other parts coming in, but I think we have actually made the first step here, and I'm very confident that the rule set as we have defined them makes its world to become really a global standard.
And Martin, I'm always curious as a reporter when I hear corporations effectively welcoming more regulation, as it were, effectively asking to be forced to be more transparent. Whenever I see that, it suggests to me that there is real economic value at the end of a process like this. Can you talk about the way in which, for big companies, for big corporates, this could actually reduce costs at the end of the day, if you believe that's the case?
Well, we don't embrace all kind of regulations, but there's good and bad ones. And I think in something like this, the value chain, you need that, because you want also to optimize the value of your product, and that ultimately will be only maximized if actually you adhere to the standards and you have transparency to the consumers. As Benedict said, people will make choices later, but they have to sure if they pay a higher price, that is also everything fine along the value chain. So it is in the purest interest also of the commercial player, and I think this is also one of the reasons why we moved forward. It is not an altruistic and idealistic approach only. It is also desperately needed to actually orchestrate that chain in terms of being commercial and competitive. It is very much about competitiveness, because certainly the battery prices have to go down if you want to penetrate electric cars. So there is this piece on one hand going down, but you want to optimize your value. So that is one piece of regulation which we embrace.
Thank you very much. Ellen, let's turn to you. You've been a champion of the circular economy, which I think several years ago might have still been sort of a somewhat foreign term to many people. I feel like it's broken through into the mainstream. And here today we're talking about a real manifestation of regulation, of public-private partnership that is starting to bring the vision of the circular economy into reality. Can you talk about how you see something like the battery passport fitting in to this work that you've been sort of beating the drum on for so long, and where you think it goes from here?
I think you need to take a step back and look at the whole economy, because I think the battery passport is a great shining light as to what's possible and what the future looks like. But when we look at the whole economy, and we've been talking about the future and what's needed, the economy has been predominantly linear. Manufacturers have been buying raw materials, making things, and then selling them. And once that product is sold, that material is lost. They have no means of recovering it, and in many cases, nor has the economy, because we don't know what sits within that product. They do. And when we look at the circular economy's three principles, we have eliminate waste and pollution, circulate products and materials for as long as possible, and then regenerate systems and nature. In order to eliminate waste and pollution, you need to not create it in the first place. And that's a design question. And that design question is crucial when it comes to the battery passport, because this whole idea is about illustrating what sits within the product. So when you illustrate what sits within the product through a passport, you know where your materials are within the world. Therefore, they have much less chance of becoming waste. Because once you've sold it and you've lost it, anyone could end up with that product. But this is about keeping the value of that battery, because we understand what sits within it, and we're then able to recover the materials and feed them back into the economy. And then that sets foot into the resilience space. Why do businesses want this change? Well, actually, they need the raw materials of the future to feed into their manufacturing processes. So you're building a circular system through the passport to enable the tracking of the materials through digital enablement to flow back into the system, which is vital for business. Business needs new raw materials in the future. And the other point that was touched on, and Martin, you mentioned it, was the 90% CO2 savings through the way that we manufacture batteries. That's massive. When we look at the need to shift towards a more climate-friendly economy, we always talk about the energy needs. We always talk about where does the energy come from, which is vital, which is why we have the electric cars, because we know that combustion engines are not the long-term future. But when we look at the split as to the carbon savings of that transition, 55% comes from the shift to renewables. cleaner energies, but 45% of the targets needed for that 1.5 degrees. That's how we make and use things. That's how we make and use batteries. That's how we collect materials and feed them into the economy, and that is huge. And that's everything. It's not just batteries. And I think this is a great example of using digital enablement to track materials within the economy. And this will be for everything in the future. This won't just be batteries. It'll be IT equipment. It'll be plastics. It'll be infrastructure. We need to know where those materials are to feed them back into the economy, not only from a resilience perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because you know where your stocks and flows are. And today we quite simply don't.
Well, an endorsement from Dame Ellen MacArthur means a lot for anyone doing work in the circular economy or in the corporate world in general. Let's turn to Inge Petersen, who's the Executive Director of the Global Battery Alliance, who has really championed this work, especially over the last 9 months. Inge, could you talk to us about what some of the challenges have been, some of the learnings, and also what comes next? Because this is an important day, but it's really just the very beginning.
Exactly. Thank you so much, David, and also the panelists. I would just like to start by acknowledging that the organizations involved in launching the world's first battery passport are true pioneers, because they're the first to ask some sometimes difficult questions about their own performance. So I would just like to officially congratulate all of our members. And it is also important to recognize that this achievement wouldn't have been possible were it not for the countless hours of in-kind expert time that we've benefited from. Establishing this proof of concept is a major milestone, but it is only the beginning. But we have, at the same time, already taken away some invaluable lessons from this. So just one thing to consider is that a typical value chain for a typical OEM for the automotives may have upwards of 40,000 suppliers. So for us to establish end-to-end value chain from cradle to gate, mine to OEM, has been a real challenge. And we were only able to overcome it due to the trust built amongst the members in the alliance, who were all united behind that vision. And interestingly, as a result of our pilots, despite the early stage, one of our participating OEMs, for the first time, learned about the exact mines they were sourcing their cobalt from. So this immediately triggered due diligence processes if these materials were actually responsibly sourced. So despite it being a proof of concept, it's already shown its effect. I think what's important is that by creating a harmonized performance standard and framework through the rule books that Martin and Benedict talked about, we'll really be able to make transparent supply chains the norm, creating the pathway to address the issues that are the most salient and with the urgency that they require. Another little point to make is that we've engaged battery manufacturers that represent over 50% of the global market. So that gives us confidence that these pilots can set the trend for the industry to become the new norm, really. Now, would the process of agreeing the reporting rules be more straightforward in a more homogeneous group in an industry setting? Certainly. But our members are completely committed to this multi-stakeholder concept. We will build on that and continue building out more comprehensive indicator frameworks, including streamlined indicators on circularity, for example. But critically, we also need to work on enabling interoperability with existing standards, systems, and frameworks, and addressing mission-critical issues of data governance, disclosure, commercially sensitive information, and data verification. So striking this balance between comprehensiveness, level of ambition, but also a company's ability to implement what we're designing is really the work that we're focusing on. And in this way, we'll work towards guiding consumer purchasing decisions based on product sustainability performance. So I'll just close by also thanking the World Economic Forum for writing the beginning of the GBA story, for which today we've completed the next chapter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Inge. Do we have any questions from the audience? We've got a few minutes. Yes, sir, please, in the front.
When you are recycling the battery, how does battery transport will work in that case? Because material may be taken out and then again put it back. So how do you do that?
So that's a question maybe Benedict, Martin, or Inge could take, which is at the point of recycling, which is, of course, you know, I don't know that any of the batteries clearly that have gotten the passport yet have been recycled yet. So some of this may be somewhat theoretical. What actually happens? How do you track it? And what happens to that initial battery passport? And is that next battery passport presumably on a battery that perhaps was actually made with recycled components, going to identify all that history of those materials?
The battery passport assigns a unique identifiable number to each battery that's in a car. So that's a big step forward. Actually, you will actually know what kind of a battery is it, what's the chemistry, and where is it, right? How long has it been used, and where is it going to end up? So it's less of a problem today because there are very few batteries that are being recycled. Recycling today happens predominantly in the actual manufacturing process because it's today a very wasteful process. A lot of materials are actually lost in the production of batteries. So I think it's a problem we'll have to solve a little later on. But this unique identifier will actually allow to find the battery and then recycle the batteries for its most valuable components. One of the challenges today is you actually cannot recycle a significant part of the battery, right? Because of the chemical composition, because of the materials that don't lend itself to recycling, but some you can. And I think over time we will be finding ways to recycle some of the other materials in the batteries as well. Lithium, for example, is very difficult to recycle today, whereas cobalt or aluminum is not. So it's over time we'll find a mechanism to do that, but we have a few more years to work on this until these big volumes of used electric vehicle batteries will hit the market.
And I think your question was also the entry point for a new battery has to have the batches of the information where it comes from.
Right.
So it has to have the end point of becoming a black mass powder, which is actually engaged in the production again. So that in that respect, you can track things for a long term. And at the very end, the nickels and the cobalt will fuel many generations cars. The cars might look different, but always the same metal doing the job. That must be the ultimate.
Battery material or the battery with the lowest CO2 footprint will be a recycled battery.
Yeah, extraordinary. Any other questions from the audience?
Can I ask one more?
Please ask one more.
So now, as you said, that there will be unique code. And you know that battery, particularly each manufacturer also tracks his battery, their life cycle time. Will there be any time conflict between tracking the unique code, or there will be no tracking of unique code? Is there any global agency will be tracking where this battery is going? Because then there might be conflict that the company which is using it also tracking its own battery, and the unique code which is a global code also being tracked.
Well, I would say if we have to have a consistent system where the information is correct, it can go in all channels, but you can always trace it back. And this is, I think, why it is important that we have one global system and not running 4 or 5 systems, because otherwise there will be information lost. Then the material will disappear and you don't know where it came from. So that is why I think the global standardization is very important. And then certainly materials travel. You might have a car assembled in one region, it goes to another region, and the end of life is another region. So if we don't close that loop, I think we lose the information. So that must be the goal.
And may I just ask a follow-up of Inga? Can you describe just very briefly where the actual data is being held and how that's being organized and how transparent that's going to be? Is it going to be open source? Is it going to be on the blockchain? Where is all this data? Because it's huge volumes that we can see is on the way. Where is it going to be held, stored, and how is it going to be accessed?
Thank you. Easy question. These rules are in fact still being written. So one of the principles that we try to implement for the proof of concept is to really enable interoperability of different IT solutions, because we believe that the market will select their own instruments and there will be much competition with different systems, different IT solutions. So the GBA doesn't see itself very much in prescribing this, but we would like to excuse me, really orchestrate this ecosystem that the different solutions can talk to each other, issue comparable information, and consistently report against the same rules so that we can benchmark it.
Okay. Yeah, more work ahead, clearly. Still to be done. We have one more question in the back.
Thank you. Could you just talk a little bit more about the pilot with the pilots with Tesla and Audi, what that entails?
Yeah.
Well, I passed that question to Inga. She's been intricately involved in those pilots. But clearly, Tesla and Volkswagen Group, I think they're by far the largest electric vehicle manufacturers. So to have them in the pilots, I think is a testimony of the relevance of the GBA and as the industry is galvanizing around these standards. So please, Inga.
Yeah, we basically had these companies involved alongside non-governmental members, international organizations, governments, to first define the rules against which they need to be assessed. In terms of the pilot participation, this was open to all of our members. It was opt-in, who wanted to be the first to disclose data that hasn't yet been asked for. So it's a brave step, which is why it's also important to note that the data in the battery passport is realistic data. It doesn't serve yet for comparison. We've selectively withheld parameters so that it cannot be prematurely compared, but we show the principles. And we've worked with these companies to mobilize their value chain, composed of GBA members, so that we can create that trusted interplay between the different actors to start sharing information without getting locked down in 10 years of NDA negotiations, and really create that trust in the system. And that's how we mobilized the cell makers, because the GBA combines really the entire value chain and is quite unique in that respect.
Are the passports showing up yet?
Yes, so if you leave the room, there is a barcode displayed at the door. You can scan it with your mobile phone and access the data.
Well, clearly we have more questions and answers than we have time for today. We are unfortunately out of time. Congratulations on the launch of the Battery Passport into the Global Battery Alliance and all its partners. Thank you very much for Ellen MacArthur for sharing with us her view that this is really the fruition, the manifestation of the circular economy, one step at a time. And thank you to all those in the room and our panelists. Thank you very much.